How are you guys tonight? Doing good? Cool. So my name is Sexton. I am a web developer at Digital Telepathy, which is a UX, UI design company downtown. We're right around, I have no idea which direction. And tonight I would like to present on what I'm calling the last jQuery boilerplate you'll ever need, which is probably not true and very arrogant, but so JavaScript was my first introduction to programming. Maybe it was the same for you guys, but a friend of mine had me doing all of these assignments where I'd learn how to write functions and variables, learn about scope, and doing for loops for days. And I ended up learning a little bit and writing code that kind of looked like this. So.
You have to stand.
Yeah, right there.
Yeah, you have to stand to the side to avoid it.
So it was very simple code, right? Not too fancy. We've got, some functions all just listed in a row, and whatever. And then on document ready, you just go and run all your functions and you bind all of your events, right? It works. So with this basic knowledge, I was able to fumble my way through my first web design job without making too much of an ass of myself. And, everything was fine. I made the websites move, I made them do stuff, and everything was just peachy. Little did I know how exposed my code was, right? So, when you're just starting out, sorry, I keep blocking this thing. When you're just starting out, very procedural code like this, it's just fine. It's just fine, right? But to give an analogy, dogs that aren't used to playing with other dogs, by themselves are generally okay, but then as soon as you throw in another canine in the mix, shit starts to go down. And code's very much the same way, right? Very naked procedural code like this, by itself, pretty harmless. But as soon as you start throwing in new JavaScript libraries and you toss it into other development environments, things get really, really messy and the bugs come out to play, right? We've all probably experienced this a little bit. So, enter this wonderful boilerplate that was developed actually by my boss that I started using since I started working at Digital Telepathy. It was developed by Dave Shepard, who is my boss, and it came out of a need for better code organization. It came out of a need for better organization for particularly jQuery plugins, especially things that you might distribute. This is going to be a really, really good introduction for those of you who have maybe not quite wrapped your head around object-oriented programming for JavaScript. So this is not a particularly advanced boilerplate, but I think it's a really, really great tool. It is not necessarily, in fact, in no way is it a replacement for things like Angular or Backbone or Batman or Pikachu or whatever you guys are using. But it is good for non-applications, for marketing sites, for blogs. This is a great place to keep your code nice and tidy so it doesn't screw with other code, and just keeps it very, very well organized. So, let's get into the code. Blah, blah, copyright, blah, blah, blah. Okay. By the way, all of this is going to be available on GitHub. It's one big project, and I'll give you guys the link somewhere on the comments. Something like that? Yeah, I'll provide that there. So, like I said, this is a good introduction to sort of object-oriented philosophies in JavaScript. The story begins with a semicolon at the top. I hope can you guys see that well enough?
Yep.
So, it starts with a semicolon. It looks a little bit weird if you're not used to seeing that. What that is for is, let's say you're concatenating two different JavaScript files together. Well, as semicolons are, optional in JavaScript, let's say the file in front of yours doesn't finish with that final semicolon. So that means when it gets squished on top of yours, there's no line break, and so there's going to be an error. So that just keeps our code really safe and protects it from other funky code. All of our code is wrapped inside of an anonymous function, and this is a special thing to JavaScript, which I'm sure many of you have encountered. And I really like it because it is a function that calls itself as soon as it's read, right? It just gets called immediately and then goes poof, which means after it's been called, it's no longer in the global namespace. So that keeps the global namespace all, non-polluted. Then let's get into the things that we are going to pass into our anonymous function. So the first thing is the $. Again, this is a jQuery plugin. We've got window and we've got undefined. Now, I'm going to scroll down to the bottom and I'm going to show you the values that we're passing into those arguments. So down here at the bottom, we've got jQuery, window, and null. jQuery, so if you guys have worked with WordPress, you know that they run jQuery in, no conflict mode, which means that you can't just automatically start using that $. You have to be like, I'm talking about jQuery, here's the object I'm talking about, and that's what we're passing here, right? Window, this is kind of optional, honestly, and it's a really easy way to be able to access the window from inside your class that we're going to go into. And then null, this is weird. This was weird. I did not realize that you could redefine undefined. It's such a weird thing in JavaScript, but you can redefine undefined as false or 0 or foobar or sandwich or whatever you want. But in our code, we want to make sure that whenever we encounter undefined, we're talking about null, because null can't be undefined. So that's another safety precaution. Then, okay, I'm going back up to the top. So there's our arguments. And then we start with our object, okay? So now there's actually 2 versions of this file that I'm going to share with you guys, but I'm mostly going to focus on this one. So we're going to wrap all of our code inside of one big object, right? This is object-oriented programming, so obviously. Inside we've got a couple of, there's something missing in this. Let me just add it in real quick. So, we got that. We've got elements and we've got selectors. So, rather than hitting the DOM every single time we need to get a jQuery element, we are going to make a big giant list of selectors in here. So, for example, what this could look like is, let's do top nav is top nav. We've got submit button is button submit, whatever. It's just a big old JSON object full of jQuery selectors. And then if we can jump back down to sort of the bottom of this file, you'll notice we've got this getElements function. And what that does is for every single jQuery selector that we've got, it goes and gets all of the objects for you, which means we don't have to keep grabbing them from the DOM over and over again. Okay, next we've got bind events. Now, bind events and then also bind vendors, more or less the same thing. This is a really nice place to keep all of your events together in one place. So you could have all of your on window resize, on window scroll, whatever you want, all in one place. What we tend to do, this is particularly helpful if you've got elements that are not yet on the page. By binding to the document rather than the actual element, you can go document on click and then delegate to whatever element is going to be triggered by the event. Bind vendors is more or less the same thing, but basically anything that's not your code. So jQuery UI, if you're calling Bootstrap, if you're using a slider, plugin, whatever you want. This would be the place to call those functions and set the options. And then after that, there's all this space that you can add your own code. So under, well, it could be anywhere in here, it doesn't really matter, but this is where you would, type in your own code. Now, something we tend to do is, I don't know how actually common practice this is. I think it's fairly common practice, but one cool trick, in order to preserve this, talking about this as in the object that we're referring to, we tend to do this. I don't know if any of you guys else do this, but that's a really, really easy way to be able to access that throughout the file, and you know that if you're using the word the variable self, you can access it wherever. So that's the basic concept of the boilerplate. Finally, we've got this initialize function. This is what's going to run all of our, it goes and creates all the elements, it goes and binds all the events, all the vendors, all that stuff. And if you needed anything done, like on document ready, this is where you would put it. You do this dot and then whatever your method name was. So, and then on document ready, you go and initialize it. That's lovely. I have another version of this. This is sort of the easy version. What this version is great for, because we're using an object, I mean, it's only well, it's not really instantiated. It's just there, right? This isn't a class, though. But if this is something that you want to use in multiple places on a site, maybe this is code for a slider or whatever you want, you may want to make a class rather than just a big old object with all of your code in it. So that's very, very similar. Starts out, same thing, anonymous function. And then here we've got our class. Class in the most loose term, because the JavaScript we know now doesn't have classes, it just has objects. So we're imitating that by assigning a function to a variable with a capital letter at the beginning. And it sort of mimics that classical structure that you'd see in Ruby or PHP. So, with that being said, do you guys have any questions? Again, all this is going to be available on GitHub. There's probably way too much documentation in the code itself, to be totally honest, because that's how my boss writes comments. But do you guys have any questions about this? Yeah.
So why are you explicitly passing?
It's a nice to have. Like, it's not necessary, but it's easier to access it that way. It's just.
One thing that I've seen that useful in is if you're using window a lot, and it really is just a nice to have. If you're using window a lot, that's like 6 characters or something. But if you throw it in your anonymous function, then window only shows up at the end of the file once, and it gets replaced by X or Z or whatever your main concatenation is, which is just extra bytes that you're saving.
You can save.
Yeah. Even if in your file it's still window, putting it in the anonymous function lets the minimizer minimize it. Whereas
Otherwise, it wouldn't measure.
right, because it's a browser.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, for like a simple website, you can write all of your JavaScript and this is how you eventually stuff.
Yeah, it's really practical for, like I said, marketing sites and blog sites. If you wanted to extend this into more application-like websites, I would maybe opt for using the class structure rather than just like the plain old object like on this one. Just so you can reuse it, you can instantiate it however you want. But
what is the advantage of maintaining another associated array / object index for selectors? I don't see why I would want to do selector custom instead of object index.
one thing that isn't that great about this boilerplate, I will admit, is the lengthiness of whenever you're trying to refer to a particular selector or a particular element. It's kind of a mouthful. I will admit that, because you're writing this dot elements dot my element, and it's like really, really long. So that can be a bit of a pain. But what this saves us is we don't have to keep, every time you do $sign and then your jQuery selector, that can, I mean, with a little bit of code, it's not that bad, but over hundreds of lines of code, it can be kind of taxing. And so,
Was it a cache this way? Did it put your cache in the
I'm doing jQuery cache.
I don't think it does.
It has a rendering engine Sizzle, which I guess, from what I understand, is helpful in that process, but it doesn't actually cache it.
Does it cache your selectors?
I don't think it
I
caches.
don't think it.
No, I mean, like,
Because it would be really trivial to do that. I don't know why that doesn't go into
If someone else knows more about that, I'd love to hear.
I don't know. I'm going to thought you should do what, I mean, I've never used Boilerplate, but
Sure.
I've always thought you should have this like a I mean, I don't know if that, I don't know, I mean, that's the way I've always done it.
Right.
From a stylistic standpoint, I can see a couple potential advantages. So advantage number 1 is anytime you're changing your CSS around, you have one place to look where you might need to change things. Advantage number 2 goes back to that same minimization question if you were worried about counting characters. Once you do this, like all those references get minimized word for
quick Google. jQuery, when you're calling just $ and passing the selector, is not going to cache that. And the main reason for that is that when you call it, and you call it again later, there's no guarantee that the DOM hasn't changed. After all, you're in jQuery language, moving things around. So it, by design, doesn't cache that $jQuery call that you made. Who knows if there's a plugin that actually facilitates that? So maybe if you're in one function and you're calling it multiple times, maybe it's smart. But I don't think it doesn't seem like it's built for that, like out of the box.
Well, in that sense, then what you had said wouldn't make sense anyway, because it's still going to have to look for the DOM. And if that's selected,
But just once.
it's just a main that references that selector string.
But it's not
No,
calling it.
so at the end of this, there's a call to .elements is equal to all of the
But it
selected.
does cache the DOM.
It caches the jQuery.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Now, there is a downside of that, though, which is if you end up removing some of those from the DOM, they now cannot be garbage collected because there's a JavaScript reference to it. So if you're adding and subtracting elements a lot, this could create a leak.
Something to watch out for if you're doing a lot of Ajax driven,
That's good. Yeah.
dynamically driven content.
It's usually not a huge issue. I think it's a very valid point. I don't think it's a huge issue due to what this is intended for.
Yeah,
Again,
simple
like
science. Yeah,
it's kind of like hide the nav, you know, it's that kind of thing. So it's not the end of the world. Like I said, it's in no way a replacement for these giant frameworks. It's just a better organization for simpler sites rather than just going all procedural.
I have another question. Do you have a similar boilerplate for plugins, for creating jQuery plugins?
I mean, I would use this. That's sort of what this is intended for.
Okay, so you're basically wrapping up each of these sites as a single plugin.
Basically, because a lot of the marketing sites that they'll just reference a single, big old concatenated JavaScript file. So, thanks, guys.
As a fellow agency developer, that's pretty interesting stuff. That was really cool.